Well, racial tension in the U.S. has been aggravated again. A university professor from Connecticut received death threats after a controversial Facebook post. In it, he calls for an end to white supremacy using an expletive-laden version of the hashtag #LetThemDie. While his post was meant as a comment on the shooting of a Republican congressman which happened last week, the storm of anger was so intense that the college authorities had to temporarily shut down the campus. The professor fled the premises and has since issued a public apology. Well, the latest figures show that hate crime in America is skyrocketing. In at least 6 big U.S. cities, this type of crime clocked up a double-digit increase last year. RT's Caleb Morpin now looks at how racial tension is dividing American society.
Reports of hate crimes have been surging across U.S. headlines in recent months. The rise of racially motivated attacks has been a trend in the United States since the 2016 presidential election. New York City has seen a 24% rise in hate crimes, with 20% across the state. Cincinnati, Ohio has seen an increase of 38%, while Chicago has seen 20%. And all of this comes as both the press and politicians have reveled in race when it comes to picking a president.
90% of the black vote is 90% of what black vote?
Trump has stood up in front of largely white audiences and described black communities in such insulting and ignorant terms.
I love the signs behind me. Blacks for Trump. I like those signs.
One thing he does know is how to get angry white men to vote for him.
President Obama over the weekend delivering a roaring and deeply personal appeal to black voters.
At times, it seemed like the election was just all about race. We heard about minorities who felt threatened by Trump and angry white men who voted for him. But if you looked for such a narrative elsewhere, you'd struggle. France, Italy, and the Netherlands, for example, don't allow any collecting of statistics based on race or religion, and it doesn't play any role in politics. So are they right and America wrong? We decided to ask people's opinions on the street.
I think it's a great thing to get statistics on what people think about in the different countries. That way you can know what type of policies need to be developed.
I think they're stirring people up to put one against the other.
Keep their doctor.
Conservative activists held rallies in Washington Sunday to decry celebrities who've joked about violence against President Donald Trump. They also protested efforts to stop contentious speakers at colleges. Both rallies attracted only a few dozen supporters, with nearly as many counter-protesters at one of the events. The weak showing contrasted with recent marches that filled cities in the United States with hundreds of thousands of people protesting Trump policies, which they believe harm immigrants, women, and other groups.
This morning, authorities in California are investigating 2 separate incidents outside mosques as possible hate crimes on the eve of one of the holiest days of Ramadan. In one incident, torn pages of a Quran were thrown out of a moving car in front of a mosque in Davis. There was a second incident then, a burned Quran filled with bacon found hanging by handcuffs from a fence outside another mosque in Sacramento.
Civil rights groups are now coming out to slam these incidents.
They want to rip out pages of any book, and in their homes, there's no issue. But when you try to intimidate a community, and unfortunately, we've been seeing a lot of these type of cases around the nation.
The Council on American Islamic Relations also issued a statement. Here's part of it. Decisive action by law enforcement authorities sends a strong message to deterrence to anyone who contemplates turning their bigoted views into acts of intimidation.
There have been more protests in central London. Members of the English Defence League took to the streets to vent their anger at a spate of Islamist terror attacks. But they were met by anti-fascist groups who organised a counter-rally chanting slogans saying refugees are welcome in the country. There's a large police presence, but as RT's Laura Smith reports, that's only adding to the tension.
Another Saturday, another protest. At least that's how it seems here in London at the moment. These are 2 small small but very scrappy demonstrations. Here we're standing with the English Defence League. They have come out today in response to the number of terrorist attacks that we have had here in the UK just over the past couple of months. They're saying enough is enough. We need to stop Islamic fundamentalism, cut it off at the roots. They're very angry about it. As I say, a small number of people. They're very, very emotional, and it's being very, very heavily policed. Then we can swing the camera around and see just a little bit on the other side. As I say, the police keep them very well apart, but those are the anti-fascists over there, Unite Against Fascism and other affiliated groups. And they are also incredibly scrappy. There's about 40, 50 of them at the last count, but they're very noisy, and they're saying these people, the English Defence League, have no place on the streets of Britain. They want to prevent them from marching. So every time the EDL comes out, the anti-fascists come out as well.
Europe's new power couple. German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron held a joint press conference concluding the European summit. Unity all over, especially when it came to one of the most contentious issues, illegal migration and the refugee crisis. The decisions taken by Chancellor Merkel were brave decisions, and I hope that we do not need to repeat them. In any case, I will do anything and stand by you, because this common challenge requires common answers. Scenes like this from last weekend have again become more and more frequent. More than 50,000 refugees have crossed the Mediterranean to Italy this year, a 26% increase compared to 2016. Today, leaders committed to step up their support for the Libyan Coast Guard to slow illegal and deadly migration. There's a high degree of consensus between Germany and France. We are talking about border security as well as the causes of migration.
Millions of new migrants could set foot on European soil next year unless steps are taken immediately. And this is a warning from a top EU official ahead of an EU summit that's being held in Brussels.
For us, it's important to work a lot in Africa. We need to have a strategy for Africa, because without a solution in Africa, we will have more and more migrants, millions and millions of migrants in the next year coming from this region. For this, we need more investment on this.
Well, Libya is the country from which most African migrants set out for Europe, and the city of Sabha is one of the key human trafficking hubs. According to reports, people there are being bought and sold on local slave markets. Our video agency Ripley managed to get a first-hand account of what life is really like in the migrant hub.
Try to come back again for my place. That is the problem. These houses people, they got kidnapping people. They tell you, give me the money, what do you work today? Many people in Sabah here, they're working for here, they have money to how to they move to Tripoli. They pay the how to they go to Tripoli.
Well, as you can see on the map right here, most human trafficking routes across Africa are leading up to Libya, meeting in the city of Sabha right here. Those hoping to make it to Europe then pay drivers to get them to the capital, Tripoli. And from there, migrants are transported by sea, packed by the hundreds on board inflatable boats, dinghies and other vessels, mostly unfit for the perilous journey across the Mediterranean. Now, some of these people get robbed, kidnapped and sometimes even murdered in the process. Meanwhile, in Europe, there are voices questioning whether those making that trip across the Mediterranean en masse are actually fleeing war and famine or just seeking better job opportunities.
As the justices issue the final rulings of their current term, the U.S. Supreme Court is set to rule on Monday in a closely watched religious rights case. The case involves limits on public funding for churches and other religious entities. The 9 justices are due to rule in 6 cases. These do not include their decision expected in the coming days on whether to take up President Donald Trump's bid to revive his ban on travelers from 6 predominantly Muslim countries. An emergency appeal in the case is pending. The court's term began in October. Of the remaining cases argued during that time, the most eagerly awaited one concerns a Missouri church backed by a conservative Christian legal group. The ruling potentially could narrow the separation of church and state.
I want to start with this Trinity Church case. What's it about? Well, the Trinity Church case is a very interesting case that has to do with separation of powers. In this case, a church in Missouri created a playground for children that had shredded tires, and then they applied to the state of Missouri for a grant to help simply cover that cost so the children can be safe. They placed very high on the grid of being able to be eligible for the grant, but the state of Missouri rejected that because they said that if they were going to help pay for that playground, that they would have what's known as excessive entanglements with a religious institution. So therefore, we have a very interesting constitutional issue of how this breaks down in separation of church and state.
A Christian school in Canada is worried about its freedom of religion after being told to stop teaching Bible verses that could be deemed offensive. The local authorities say passages in the Bible that denigrate or vilify one's sexual orientation should not be studied in class. The school disagrees, however, saying the ban would violate its constitutional rights. The authorities are standing their ground, though, insisting that the potentially offensive passages should not be a part of the curriculum.
President Donald Trump acknowledged Russian meddling in the presidential election in a tweet on Friday in an attack on former President Barack Obama. Trump wrote, "Just out, the Obama administration knew far in advance of November 8th about election meddling by Russia. Did nothing about it. Why?" Trump may have been referencing a Washington Post report that the CIA had confirmed Russian President Vladimir Putin's direct influence on alleged interference in the 2016 election. A top official told NBC that senior advisors to the president urged him to avoid discussing the Russian investigation earlier this week. According to the Israel Defense Forces, Israel launched strikes on Syrian military positions Saturday. The strikes were close to the two countries' disputed border in the Golan Heights. The action was a response to what the IDF said were more than 10 projectiles fired into Israel from inside Syria. Blaming it on internal fighting, the IDF described the projectile fire as errant. The IDF said Israeli aircraft targeted 3 positions from which the projectiles were fired. The strikes included hits on 2 tanks belonging to the Syrian regime.
Well, now to the battle against the radical Islamic terrorists overseas. The president facing a bit of a dilemma as he works on a campaign promise to destroy ISIS and Syria in Iraq. You know, tensions have been escalating between the U.S., Russia, and Moscow's ally Syria over those recent U.S. military strikes against Syrian government forces. And if that were not enough, yesterday Israel fired back over the Syrian border after it says projectiles from the fighting landed in the Golan Heights. Several Syrian tanks were reportedly destroyed. So could this conflict spread to a wider war, and what steps should the Trump administration take next?
Once ISIS is defeated, and it will be defeated, the only question is when. It should be sooner rather than later. But once it's defeated, it will leave a power vacuum, and Iran and the Assad regime and Russia and Hezbollah will move to try and fill it. That's why I think what we need to do is get more Arab forces involved, not the Iraqi forces under the influence of Iran, but from Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf monarchies. They have a big stake here too, maybe even bigger than ours. They have not participated in this fight as much as they should have. In fact, some of them have been on the side of ISIS, if you believe press reports. We can turn that around, or at least we should try and turn it around, or we will simply find that after defeating ISIS, in the post-ISIS environment, we're seeing the foundation laid for the next war.
Syria's government says it has released 672 prisoners who had promised to accept the state's authority, a move it said was aimed at bolstering a reconciliation process.
The pardon of the ISIL members is a sign that some in Syria are considering a future when ISIL no longer controls Raqqa, its self-proclaimed capital. Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, says it captured the men as part of their offensive in Raqqa, after determining they were low-level fighters with, quote, no blood on their hands. They were handed to the Raqqa Civil Council. It's expected to govern the city when it falls. The men were driven to the council's headquarters and lined up, where they listened to speeches and were given sweets.
About 6 months ago, I joined. They were very harsh against the people. They wouldn't give anyone a chance to work outside their own sphere. There was a lot of psychological pressure.
Some admit they were lured by the money.
I joined them because I needed to work. There was no work, and they used violence.
The end of Ramadan amnesty is the first step in laying out a foundation for a post-ISIL future, one that emphasizes reintegration and rehabilitation.
Countries in Southeast Asia are fighting back against violent extremism. Foreign affairs representatives from the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia met this Thursday in Manila to discuss terrorism concerns. In light of recent terrorist attacks in the region, the countries agreed to take immediate actions like sharing intelligence and continuing to deploy trilateral patrols on their borders. For future meetings, the three countries also plan to block the flow of terrorist financing, weaponry, and extremist content on social media. In the Philippines, the epicenter of the region's war on terrorism is the island of Mindanao. After more than a month of fighting, crisis management officials say up to 40% of Marawi City has been destroyed. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, who declared martial law in the island, has apologized for the damages but promised that he would work to rebuild the city.
I would like to say to the Maranao people that I am very, very, very sorry.
In Indonesia, terrorist attacks hit Jakarta last month. A suicide bombing at a bus terminal left 5 dead and 10 wounded. Malaysia's deputy prime minister links both attacks to the killing of a Malaysian Islamic State leader. The country's most wanted terrorist, Mahmud Ahmad, is still fighting in Marawi City. In an effort to continue strategizing, the three countries will hold their next meeting this October in Indonesia.
After America's Defense Secretary admitted U.S. failings in Afghanistan last week, the Pentagon seems to have been looking for somebody to blame, and it's found someone. In its first report to Congress since the election, the Pentagon named Pakistan as the single greatest external factor hindering U.S. actions. The report refers to what it calls support of Afghan insurgents by the Pakistani government. During 16 years of its involvement in Afghanistan, Washington has given a range of reasons why its Afghan campaign wasn't going to plan.
Iran is reportedly arming and funding the Taliban.
Corruption is a huge challenge in Afghanistan.
Russia is now meddling in Afghanistan.
It's very difficult to succeed on the battlefield when your enemy enjoys external support and safe haven.
We had the overt legitimacy lent to the Taliban by the Russians.
Now, over 100 people were killed in Pakistan Sunday morning when an overturned oil tanker exploded as people were trying to collect petrol from it. The incident took place in an area near Bahawalpur in Pakistan's Punjab province. Dozens more are said to have been injured, with many in critical condition, suffering from severe burns. Unconfirmed reports say the tanker turned over because it was speeding. People rushed to gather the fuel leaking from it before it caught on fire. It's feared that the death toll could rise, and with many bodies said to have been burnt beyond recognition, it's being reported that DNA sampling will have to be used to identify them.
Well, more than 100 firefighters from 2 states responded to a massive mill fire Friday. That was in southern Maine. More than a day later, the building is still smoldering. Firefighters are at the scene in case it flares up. The 95-year-old building was once a textile mill. The cause of the fire is under investigation.
Tonight, rescuers desperately digging through the rubble. As many as 120 people missing, feared buried beneath this crush of heavy rocks and mud. Officials say the massive landslide came with no warning at 6 a.m. local time in China's Sichuan province. Heavy rain causing the mountainside to crumble onto the village below. A second smaller landslide triggering boulders to topple onto the village. Search dogs, heavy equipment, and instruments to detect life all deployed for finding signs of survivors, like Chao Dashuai and his family. He says dozens of households in the village were completely buried, and he says his 1-month-old son saved them by crying and waking them up moments before the mudslide hit. I was pinned down in the dining room. We slowly got up, held the baby, and escaped, he explains. Tonight, with at least 15 dead, rescuers are still hoping for more stories like his, uncovering crumbled pieces of some of the more than 40 homes that were obliterated. A hotel is also buried beneath the rubble, but officials say it's still unclear whether any tourists are among the missing. There's severe weather on both coasts for the first weekend of summer. In the west, the extreme heat is still on, and it's fueling an outbreak of wildfires in several states. In the east, what's left of Tropical Storm Cindy has left a big mess to clean up. Here's Carter Evans.
Torrential rain drenched the Northeast with up to 3 inches falling in parts of New Jersey. A powerful punch from what's left of Tropical Storm Cindy, 2 days after it made landfall along the Gulf Coast. The massive storm left a trail of destruction and even spawned a tornado in Pennsylvania, snapping trees around Jim Lindley's home.
I tried to step out the door and everything was spinning. I saw pieces of parts of trees. It was like so black you couldn't even see through it.
They're cleaning up in Fairfield, Alabama, after an EF2 tornado ripped through town, leaving one person injured in a liquor store that was nearly flattened. In other parts of Alabama, flash floods swamped cars and stranded drivers.
There she is. She got out.
Farther west, extreme heat is fueling a 37,000-acre fire in Utah. Flames have been burning out of control for days, destroying 13 homes.
A fire of this magnitude with this much energy out there just does what it wants.
More than a dozen wildfires are burning in Arizona, where the governor has declared a state of emergency. Many of the fires are burning in record-breaking triple-digit temperatures. It reached 119 degrees in Phoenix this week, so hot that the air was too thin for some planes to take off.